Okay, so now we're on to chapter 7. So I got a little bit cut off there at the end, but we certainly can talk about the force field model a bit more in class, and then correlation is something that you'll have to become more aware of it as you do additional research. It'll certainly come in handy on this last paper that we have due. So apologize for the intermittent background noise as well. So I'll pop through chapter 7, which is really about interventions, and it's really going to go into setting up all of the different approaches to interventions that we'll talk about over the course of the rest of the semester. And so let me just get moving on with that. So there's 4 types of major interventions: human process, technostructural, human resource management, and then strategic. And so we'll certainly tackle each of those over several chapters in each domain as we continue the year. So just as a high level, these are really introductory. Human process interventions really deal with consultation, third-party interventions. A lot of these deal with conflict, where you might have to go in and do some group dynamics work. Team building is another area where human process comes into play. And then you'll do intergroup relations, again, group dynamics, which some of you have had some real up-close experience with that. Large group interventions, where you're working together in more than a group of 5 or 6. And then culture change certainly plays into this, and that is more of a long-term strategy related to human process. Technostructural really looks at something like parallel structures would be an example, where you have something that's not working, and so you may have your ongoing operational structure, and then under it you may try to beta test another type of structure and then integrate it at the end. Total quality management is a continuous improvement cycle. High involvement organizations may deal with having people much more involved in their own job design. Job enrichment really addresses some of the elements of quality of life at the workplace. Self-managed work teams. We'll do a little bit of work with this. There's an author by the name of Lulu that did a book called Reinventing Organizations, and I think it's a pretty cool video that I'll show you on that. And then re-engineering jobs is certainly another technostructural approach. So again, looks at the element of structural design using technology, and we'll talk a bit more about how that plays out over that particular set of chapters. Human resource management. This is probably one where I spend the most time, so it's probably the one that's most comfortable for me. Certainly goal setting plays into this a bit. Performance appraisal, reward systems or incentive systems about how you do kind of transactional rewards for groups or individuals. Individual and group coaching or mentoring certainly plays into the context of human resource management. Leadership development and career planning development. I've got a couple of slides on that I'll follow up with. And then workforce diversity. We'll spend nearly an entire chapter on that. And then workplace stress and wellness certainly are part of this domain. And so leadership development programs, here's an example of something that I've authored, which is a 4-segment leadership development program for, say, high potential work teams or teams where they're trying to really upskill them in a short period of time. I may go into an organization and provide this type of executive education over the course of 4 different days, maybe separated by a couple of months. So, the first day might be assessment using DISC. The second day may be generational differences in building employee retention. The third day in this instance is coaching for success, which is giving, people that are leaders of leaders, give them some tools on how to peer coach. And then day 4 might be productive conflict and negotiation, because figuring out how to work through that is powerful and useful for everyone. So that's an example of an LDP program that might fall into this area and domain of human resource management. And then here's another thing that I use with some of my clients. This is what I call an unscripted plan, hence the name of my company, where someone does an actual personal strategy plan with a vision, a mission, really looking at the high level strategies or goals of what's important to them. and then how would be some of the tactics they take to accomplish their goals, and then values would be sort of the underlying basis of who they are as a person and what's important to them and that are enduring over time. And, I may sit down with someone in a coaching engagement where they're thinking about a transition and really outline this type of thing. So certainly glad to share this with you and talk more about it. Strategic change interventions. This really is a pretty big catch-all, and it certainly deals with a lot of the current phase of OD is where it is right now. A lot of it deals with organization design. Some of it may be mergers and acquisitions or downsizing, sort of a reactive approach. And then you've certainly got strategy making, and how do you establish a long-term strategy. Strategies years ago may have had a 10-year horizon, and now it's very difficult to strategize for, in some cases, months. But, anything more than a 5-year plan sometimes is pretty challenging these days. Learning organizations is really cool, where you continue to elevate your game over time. Agile organizations, where you're always adaptive to the environment. And then networks is another powerful way for groups to organize, very common in the gig economy today. And then global social change is another area that kind of falls inside this domain. So that really is 4 particular areas of intervention that we'll talk about over the course of time. And then kind of switching gears, I don't usually spend a lot of time on this, but I'm going to talk about it just briefly now, which are sort of the customs and the value systems that play out globally with regard to change. And so the first piece of this is context. I don't have that slide posted here, but context is sort of the formalization of rituals and whatnot. And so that plays out a lot in Asian and Latin American countries, where you have people may have a lot of routines that kind of are associated with their organizations or how they build their culture. And so when you think about working with the Japanese, oftentimes they're very slow to decide, and they usually do it in a real collective way that isn't sometimes to American companies seems opaque, but it's very ritualistic. And so that's context. This one that I've got a slide up here for is power distance, is the extent to which they accept status and power and how it's distributed throughout the organization. Oftentimes this might be an autocratic environment with little employee participation. You might think about this as being, the Soviet bloc of countries now that you have. There's more of an oligarchy that runs a lot of the decision making that happens within those countries and those domains of those industries. So you Eastern European countries sometimes fall into this area. Uncertainty avoidance is the nature for which members accept ambiguity, and so they value expertise. They prefer clear roles. They avoid conflict. They resist change, and so this sometimes plays out in Asian countries, certainly more so than others. But experts have most of the status and the authority, and often drive the decision-making process. And then an achievement orientation is the extent to which people value assertiveness and acquisition of material goods. So they seem to, these sort of societies associate well with achievement, wealth, and recognition. And gender roles are clearly differentiated, and oftentimes the female gender often is muted of power versus the male gender. And so you see this a bit as well in Asian and Latin American countries, as well as South Africa. And then last but not least, our individualism. This is the extent to which people believe they should be responsible for themselves and their immediate family, kind of a hands-off, let me, don't tread on me, let me take care of myself. And so you certainly see a lot of autonomy, personal initiative, competition, and autonomy is prized within these types of societies. And not surprisingly, this is most akin to the United States with sort of how our founding fathers started, and certainly to where we are today, which is leave me alone and let me have a meritocracy. Let the merits of my own work decide my outcome. So that just gives you a little bit of an overview of sort of how different cultures accept it. The book does a fairly nice job. There's a table on 7.1 on page 151 that I think is pretty useful. And so then economic development certainly plays into this. You have some economies where it's agriculture-based, very base of the pyramid type of societies where they haven't really industrialized in a big way. And so farming and bartering is still very popular, and legitimacy of organizations is very uncommon. Industrialized economies are moderately developed and tend to be rich in natural resources. So you might think of China as an area that has this, though their economy is certainly more mature than most of their peers. And then industrial economies are highly developed and emphasize things like non-agriculture industries, so technology, research, intellectual property all play a huge role. So you certainly think of the U.S., but you also might think of Singapore, Japan as well. So those are all elements that kind of play into that. I'd like you to spend just a few minutes watching this video by Richard Reeves. I think it really helps in the context of power and individualism in the respect of the United States. Reeves is part of the Brookings Institute, and he's done a pretty profound display using Legos to talk about the social mobility in U.S. societies and the economy. And so it's insightful. So I encourage you to spend a few minutes watching this, and glad to talk about it. I've heard him speak. He's pretty big on the scene with regard to social mobility. And then there's another little 2x2 matrix here that kind of gives you an overview of what we just talked about. And so that sort of wraps up that chapter 7. Really spend, we're going to certainly address each of those particular 4 domains of intervention. But our next class after this will be June 17th. You'll have your insight papers due. So I haven't had any questions on that yet, but really encourage you to focus on, what's important relative to what I wrote up in the syllabus. Then we'll also talk about chapters 8 and 9, managing change and operationalizing interventions, and then we'll discuss the group project. Actually, I'll probably give you a fair amount of time on the group project on the 17th. So certainly encourage you to looking forward to seeing the discussion that you have on the forum and reading your insight papers in a couple of weeks. And as always, just give me a call or shoot me a note if you have any questions. Thanks.